Very interesting thing which I again found, that the Jains were not only huge patrons of Prakrit, they were also pioneers of vernacularization.
Hello Kshitij, how are you?
I am good, Padmanabha. How are you?
I'm good as well. So what are you doing these days?
Well, I am just preparing for my final exam, submitted my dissertation a few weeks ago. So now I'm nearing the end of my MPhil.
How are you feeling nearing your MPhil?
I mean, yeah, it has been a roller coaster. It has been a great journey, and now, yeah, I am just in the final leg of my marathon. So I hope that goes well.
It will. Surely it will go
Thank
well.
you very much.
So let us discuss about your area of interest and what are you doing your MPhil on.
Sure.
So the floor is up to you.
Sure, thank you very much, and it's great talking to you on this podcast. So, my area of interest primarily, first of all, I think I should tell that what is my education in. So, I did my bachelor's in Sanskrit from St. Stephen's, University of Delhi. Then I followed that up with my current degree, that is an MPhil in Classical Indian Religion at the University of Oxford. I am in my second year right now. My major area of interest is Jainism. I work on Jaina Studies, apart from Hindu studies and classical Sanskrit literature. And my area of expertise or my area of research right now is Digambara Jain Monastic Law Books. So I think I should explain this a bit, that what is Digambara Jainism.
We'll come to that.
Sure.
We'll come to that. So first, before getting into Digambara Jainism and Svetambara Jainism and all into that, just quickly within a minute or two, can you just explain what Jainism is?
Sure. So Jainism is one of the three ancient traditions of India, religious traditions of India, alongside Hinduism and Buddhism. All Jains consider Jinas, or the victorious ones, to be their teachers who have won over the world and who have attained liberation. All Jains aspire for liberation, and they basically follow 5 great vows, that is non-violence, non-possession, non-stealing, non-carnality, and lack of possessions.
Perfect. So again, many people might know while looking this podcast, if you have come this far, that you might be interested in Jaina Studies itself. So there are 2 types of Jaina communities in India, Svetambara and Digambara.
Yes.
I know only a bit of that. I don't know in great detail. So can you just mark out the differences between Svetambara and Jaina Digambara without getting into much detail, because we'll get into your topic soon.
So one of the reasons why I started working on, why I got interested in monasticism, was that it has impacted the Jain society and its social formations in very deep manners since its very beginning. So this distinction of Digambara and Svetambara primarily corresponds to monastic practices, and later on it developed into societal differences between lay communities, their castes, and everything. The basic difference between who is a Digambara and who is Svetambara corresponds to a monk. The monk who remains naked, who does not wear clothes, is a Digambara monk, because Digambara literally means sky-clad.
Yes.
Whereas Svetambara is the monk who wears a white cloth. And the basic difference in philosophy is that while the Digambaras believe that any form of clothing is a possession, and ultimately that is a hindrance to liberation, which a monk cannot afford, Svetambaras believe that, okay, even if you wear a cloth, or even if you wear a white piece of cloth, if you are not attached to it mentally, so that is not a possession. So that is a primary difference of marker, and that went on to develop into other differences in monastic practices, other various issues of monasticism, as well as societal differences. And yeah, so it's a complicated history, but in the very beginning time period, this was the main reason.
So very good. I get why two different groups of people come to exist. So coming to your area of interest and in your MPhil.
Sure.
So can you just first tell the title of your dissertation,
Sure.
and then we'll move on one by one to what you're doing exactly.
Well, my title is slightly longish, but I hope the viewers find it good. It's titled Texts, Traditions and Transformations, Historicizing Digambara Jain Monastic Law Books, c. 1100 to 1500 C.
So you're looking at Digambara monastic law books from
Yes.
1100 to 1500.
Yes.
So now coming to this particular area, is there a very important reason that you have taken this area?
Yes,
I mean, the time period is what I'm more interested in, because I'm pretty much sure that much has come later as well, and much has come before as well.
So, well, it is a pertinent question to ask, that why I have chosen this research field in the first place, and that is something which I also contemplated, that when I first began to get interested into Digambara monastic law books. One of the reasons is that within Jain studies, historically Digambara Jainism has attracted lesser attention. I'm not saying that scholars have not worked on Digambara Jainism, but the overall degree of focus on Digambara Jainism has been historically lower. And within Digambara Jainism, the question of social history of Digambara Jain communities, I say the word communities because of their regional, cultural, political differences, it has been completely overlooked. So if we see the history of Jain studies, basically scholars were more interested into Digambara philosophical texts, or to an extent narrative texts, which is fair enough. But what I found interesting, or instead of interesting is lacking, is that there has not been much done on the social history of Digambara Jain communities. And to correlate this to how my interest in monasticism comes into play, when I first discovered this textual archive for myself, when I first came across it, my initial idea was that, okay, if the earlier monastic law books were being produced in 2nd century CE, so why after a gap of 9 centuries, a gap of 900 years, why did the Digambaras start to produce monastic law books again in 11th century CE? That was the leading question, which is something I observed while making a complete list or a basic table of what are the sources I have. And that made me realize that there must be something going on in this period which prompted the Digambaras to codify their monastic laws. And if we correlate this or corroborate this with Indian historiography, medieval period or the early medieval period is precisely when there is a flurry of social changes, there is a flurry of cultural, economic and religious changes across India, and every religious tradition is affected in some or the other way.
Well, this was something that I was thinking as well while you were speaking, because when you come to the 8th century and 9th century, we have a lot of invasions in the northwest of India, which basically changed the cultural and religious landscape in the northwest of India at that point of time. So yes, there might be a very good reason why the Jaina community might have felt to codify their laws as well. But what I'm interested to kind of know about is you have, while discussing it earlier with you today while we were roaming around Oxford, you just mentioned to me that there was a change in language as well.
Yes.
While the Digambara Jain community took up onto them to codify it in a certain language, and that is Sanskrit.
Yes.
While it was done in a different language earlier.
Exactly.
So what do you think was the reason, and why did they did it? First, let us get into the first reason,
right,
and then we'll focus on the other parts.
Sure. So you mentioned two things. Firstly, you mentioned the changing political dynamics. So while I agree that changing socio-political narratives and socio-political dynamics would have been a very important reason, because every community, if we look at it, it is not just about preservation but also about attracting patronage, because historically all the communities across a spectrum of Indian religions, they have tried to, even in medieval period of Sultanate era or later on Mughal era, they tried to attract patronage. So in case of Digambaras, for example, the major centers of Digambara lineages in medieval Rajasthan or medieval northwest India were precisely located or developed on regions which were important Mughal centers, or which were centers of important trade routes.
By patronage over here, are we meaning the economic patronage, or are we talking about it in the missionary sense of it, like attracting more people into the faith? Or to put it very bluntly, how can someone become a Digambara Jain? Or is it that, let us say if I am a person, how do I become, or is it possible for me to become a Digambara Jain? Or is it only possible if you are born a Digambara Jain?
This is a completely different question which you have raised, which is also very interesting considering how Jain society is basically structured. But on the point of patronage, yes, it is economic patronage.
Okay.
But if you also look at certain Svetambara monks like Jin Chandrasuri and others who stayed in Akbar's court for some time. So the Svetambara legends claim that Akbar was greatly influenced by them. And it is I think very natural to look from a social history point of view that every community which wants to preserve itself or which wants to preserve its religious, economic, political rights will try to align itself with the ruling diaspora. So that is not a very big surprise. When I look at this period, what I find more and more that there is less of a disruption and more of a reorganization, and there would have been multiple reasons behind that. Now the second question which you asked, that how do you become a Digambara Jain? Well, the answer is not straightforward because Indian religions technically do not have a method of conversion.
Yes, exactly.
That if there is no proselytization or there is no baptism per se. So I think it depended on the caste you were in. Because for example, in Digambara Jains, there are a lot of Agrawal Jains. Agrawals are basically a mercantile class in Hindus also, primarily in Hindus.
Yeah.
So after one point of time, I believe that if a particular family of Agrawals or a particular caste group or a local village group, if it started to follow the Jain path, if it started to go to a Jain monk for their spiritual guidance, if they started to worship the Jain temples, so after a point of time they would have become more inclined towards Jainism. And my personal understanding is that before the introduction of census, where everything was being classified, religious identities in India were anyway very fluid.
Well, agreed with that, because even in Hinduism, there is no particular conversion from one particular school of thought to another. Rather, one believes it and follows it. But agreed, it is very fluid to...
But there we find, in some manuals, we do find, very interestingly, we do find methods by which a non-Jain should be converted into a Jain.
Oh, that's very interesting. Okay, that will go on a very different tangent.
That is something which I am also currently reading. And coming back to your question of language. So just to briefly summarize our readers, the early Digambara monastic law books, which were composed around 2nd, 3rd century CE, they were composed in an ancient language called Prakrit. So there are basically two ancient languages in India, Sanskrit and Prakrit, which have developed simultaneously. And while Sanskrit was primarily a Hindu language used by Brahmin authors from its beginning, the Jains took Prakrit in its initial days. And the first Jain text to be written in Sanskrit was the Tattvard Sutra of Umaswati in 5th, 6th century CE. So for a long time period, the Jains stuck to Prakrit. So it makes complete sense that any text in 2nd century CE would have been written in Prakrit. But when this shift happens of starting to write in Sanskrit text, in the early medieval period or even in late ancient period, late post-Gupta period, we then find a very massive corpus, a very massive literary corpus of literature being produced in Sanskrit, whether it is poetry, whether it is commentaries, whether it is original epistemological text. And in this time period, after 7th or 8th century CE, the Digambara Jains first start to use Sanskrit, experiment with Sanskrit as a literary language. So it makes complete sense that in 11th century CE, when the Jains are codifying their own laws, they are using the authority given by Sanskrit, because we have this whole discourse of Sanskrit cosmopolitan by Sheldon Pollock, who argues that Sanskrit has been not only the language of a vehicular language of poetic and religious ideas, but it has also been a symbol of political power. Not going into that, very interesting thing which I again found, that the Jains were not only huge patrons of Prakrit, they were also pioneers of vernacularization.
Well, agree with this because a lot of Tamil literature, if you go back to the Sangam period, started from Ilango Adigal and all, we have Tamil Jains who
even in Kannada. But the time period I am looking at right now, the early medieval or pre-10th century C time period, it is a time period when the Jains have already begun to shift to vernacular languages, whether it is Kannada in south, whether it is Apabhramsha in north, and following in the following centuries by 14th-15th century, whether it is Braj and Rajasthani in northwest India. But then the question arises that even if the linguistic trends are changing along with popular needs, the Jains are very particular about writing their monastic law books in Sanskrit, which I think is a form of engaging with the wider intellectual sphere or wider intellectual context of that time period.
At the same time, I was just thinking if writing in Sanskrit also gave a sense of superiority to a lot of people, because Sanskrit was considered and is still today a language of authority among a lot of theologians.
As I mentioned, it has been considered not only a language of religious or political ideas, it has been a political expression. So any form of Sanskrit literary production is in itself an assertion of certain socio-political authority. And when in the time period when different groups were always engaged in a competition of patronage, a competition of intellectual superiority, so yes, it became important for the Jains to write in Sanskrit, primarily in the first place to engage with the Brahmin authors and to sort of put their literature into highlight, because not everyone was reading Prakran.
I do agree with this point as well, because when I was reading the medieval Telugu literature, which goes from 15th century onwards and even before that 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, we see a clear shift in Telugu literature as well from a very rudimentary form of Telugu to a very Sanskritized form of Telugu, because a lot of authors started introducing Sanskrit words into Telugu just to make sure that it is way more appealing to a lot of people. I don't know if it did good or bad. That's a different question. Now let us move into the next part of your PhD. So what exactly are you working on? The corpus. I'm more interested in the corpus.
Sure.
So what is the corpus that you're working on? I got the time period right now. I got what we are looking at. What is a corpus now?
Sure, very interesting, very important question. So when I say that Digambara Jain started writing Sanskrit monastic law books starting from 11th century CE, so you basically find 4 monastic law books, starting with the Charitrasar of Chavanraya in Karnataka, presumably Karnataka or Deccan in 11th century CE, followed by the Acharasar of Veernandi in 12th century CE, and now the literary production moves to the north of India. So it began in south, but it shifts to north. The third law book, the Anagara Dharmamrita of Ashadhara, was written in 13th century CE, Malwa or in Madhya Pradesh. And the final important law book, or the final law book, Sanskrit law book which we have, is the Mulachara Pradeepa of Sakala Kirti in 15th century CE, Rajasthan. So for a couple of centuries, for 4 or 5 centuries, we see a continuous production of monastic law books. And also this is the time period, and I think I missed this fact before, this is the time period when early Prakrit texts, the ones we looked back in 2nd century CE, they got their Sanskrit commentaries. So that is also part of my corpus.
Well, very interesting thing that you just mentioned. It started from the south and then it went to the north. Is there a reason for that, or did you find any kind of link that proves some kind of hypothesis for this?
Well, when I first noticed this, I was not even that serious that maybe it's just a coincidence, but it cannot be a coincidence, because clearly the focus of early monastic literature is in Deccan, the thrust is in Deccan, and then it moves to northwestern and central India. So while I do not have a full explanation that as to why is it happening, one reason is that, again, because the social history of Digambara Jains has not been studied properly, so there are a lot of sources which we have simply not come across. But one explanation which I might be able to offer right now is the expansion of monastic lineages, because the available epigraphical records of Digambara monastic lineages precisely start from South India, The earliest monastic lineages as well as their epigraphical records are found in a place called Shravanbelgula in Karnataka, which is of huge religious importance for every Digambara Jain or in Jain community in general. But as we see with the inception of what we call medieval period post 10th century CE, these monastic lineages now begin to expand in North India. So as we move into 11th century CE, we come up with new monastic lineages which are now expanding rapidly in Rajasthan, in Madhya Pradesh, even in Gujarat, and that is why I think the production of monastic law books corroborates with how lineages are expanding, because whenever a new lineage would be formed, it would need some sort of textual authority, it would need some sort of textual manual to organize its community, to organize its code of conduct, and that is why monastic law books were being produced in the first place.
So the lineages that were expanding, all these lineages had a similar theological foundation, or different lineages followed different theological foundations?
Well, very, very interesting again. I mean, all of the lineages, so basically when I mean lineages, so the original Digambara monasticism is said to have been divided into 6 sanghas or 6 monastic orders, out of which the Moola Sangha or the root Sangha is considered to be the ancient one, the most ancient one, and the continuous one which has continued up to our times. Now within the Moola Sangha there were 2 divisions, the Sen Gana and the Balatkar Gana. Sen Gana is the older one, Balatkar Gana is the Balatkar Gana emerged after 10th century CE, and it went on to become the most successful Mool Gana lineage. And also we had the Kashtha Sangha, which is a different Sangha from Mool Sangha. So these are 3 monastic lineages which we have in medieval India. I do not know about Kashtha Sangha because there is not much material available on its history honestly, but all of the Mool Sangha lineages have a common ancestry to Kundakunda. So Kundakunda is considered to be the greatest and the single most important pontiff in Digambara monastic and literary history, and every lineage somehow tries to connect themselves with him. That okay, so they provide Pattavalis. So for our readers, Pattavali is a given lineage, an epigraphical lineage where Guru Shishya Parampara, teacher and student, teacher student, teacher student, an unbroken chain of teacher and their students will be given. So yes, their theological origin is one there, and in terms of practice, I guess they were more or less the same in terms of practice, but it was also about legitimacy. Everyone wanted to have that share of legitimacy.
What about jurisprudence then? Because if there are different lineages at the same time, if all of them are following a similar theme or similar way of life, then I presume that they are also following similar jurisprudence. Or there might be another answer for this, because if at all everybody is following the same thing, then why have different lineages? You can have a single lineage which basically encompasses everything. If you have different lineages in the first place, then you also tend to have different jurisprudences for every single lineage. Am I right at this, or am I going somewhere wrong?
Well, I mean, it is partially true. So when you say that why lineages formed in the first place, so one reason is geographical expansion, because not one single lineage cannot reach in every region, and when a tradition or when a system reaches up to regional levels, so hyper localization takes place, and at that point of time there must occur various lineages. One more reason that why lineages developed in the first place was breaking away. So every influential monastic figure, I presume, would have wanted to establish their own monastic lineage. And now coming back to jurisprudence, so I mean this question cannot be answered in full, because whatever literature we have is precisely from Mool Sangha, and that too majorly from Balatkar Gana. So when I say that this is Digambara Jain monastic law books, I add the caveat that it is Digambara Jain Moola Sangha monastic law books. But because we do not have any monastic literature as of now from the Kashtha Sangha, from any other group, so we cannot really presume that if there were major differences in monastic jurisprudence. What I assume from available sources is that there were very minute and very small identity markers. Like for example, in the case of Kastha Sangha, it is said that they worshipped idols made of wood, which is just a story. There is no authentication. But what it reflects is that primarily the monastic conduct or monastic practices would have remained more or less the same, but there would have been certain principles or certain practices where the groups diverged. And more than theological standpoints, this relates to identity building. Because every community or every group, if it wants to have an independent identity, it needs to show itself as distinguished or distinct from the other. So there is a process of othering. Every group wants to show itself as distinct, and it wants to recognize who I am distinct against. So if I am me, or if I am the one, who is my other? So I think a lot of monastic practices or religious practices in general in Indian religions, and I think that goes with all religions and traditions around the world, have precisely developed for this need of distinguish between who I am and who is the other.
Well, that is true, because even in Christianity, when we have different denominations, and every denomination has their own kind of marker. Even in Hinduism, every single school of thought has its own marker. It might be a physical marker, it might be a theological marker, might be any other marker. So we have covered about the corpus that you're working on. So let us now look at what this corpus is telling us about. So all the texts that are available to us, are they written only in Sanskrit? And are the translations available for them? And how good are these translations?
Two very important questions for anyone who's doing literary studies or who is working on who is working through philological methodologies.
Well, because with Sanskrit, the biggest problem is one word can have multiple meanings to it.
And the usage of words is in a lot of cases intentional, so it becomes very context sensitive. So you asked me about, yes, they are all in Sanskrit, they are all in good ornate literary Sanskrit. Translations, yes, luckily there have been critical editions published. So just for our viewers, a critical edition of a Sanskrit text is an edition which is prepared after consulting multiple manuscripts or versions of one Sanskrit text, deciding what should be the most grammatically correct and logical sequence of text, and then giving its translation. So I am lucky in that way that I don't have to deal with untranslated or unedited manuscripts a lot. But in terms of translation, yes, at some places it's good, because a lot of traditional Digambara scholars were of early modern times or of modern times were great Sanskrit scholars. But sometimes, yes, the idea of context sensitivity or of historical sensitivity that I'm particularly looking at, it becomes challenging. So at that time period, I have to rely more on my own philological skills to interpret and analyze any particular text.
I was also about to ask you about if there were any contemporary commentaries on these texts, because let us say for our viewers what a contemporary commentary is. For instance, if we take the example of Natya Shastra by Bharat Muni, we have the critical edition of that by Abhinav Gupta. So in that context, do we have any kind of commentaries written by people about these monastic texts in the contemporary times, or like 100-200 years later as well?
I won't say Abhinav Gupta's Abhinav Bharati to be a contemporary.
Not contemporary. I was just giving a kind of a very, very far-fetched example. It's not properly.
But I get it. So as I told you before, there are Sanskrit commentaries on earlier Prakrit law books in this time period. But on these 4 monastic law books, there have not been independent commentaries by other authors. So Ashadhara is the only exception who writes an auto commentary. So auto commentary means that he is commentating himself on his own text. But apart from him, no, we do not find a commentary on these texts, and the reason being that we already have commentaries on earlier Prakrit law books. So it would have not made much of a sense.
Then it would be redundant and be regarded
become redundant to, in the first place, have a Sanskrit commentary of earlier Prakrit texts, and to then write commentaries on Sanskrit monastic law books which were precisely based or rooted in the early Prakrit versions.
Then when did the interest in these books start? Because if we don't have any commentaries on these books at the contemporary periods, or like 100-200 years later as well,
Yes.
then I presume that not many people outside the community were very interested in those books as well.
Oh, definitely.
Then when did the proper interest in these books, studying them critically, begin?
So you are asking in my
Yeah, I mean not you as in you, but historically, when did the interest in studying this monastic law book start?
I mean, for a monk's perspective, from an emic communitarian perspective, these monastic law books are very important because yes, they discuss monastic conduct, they are very venerable, they are authentic sources of dharma of a muni. So the monks have always been studying them. Mulachara has been very widely studied. Anagar Dharmamrita is also widely studied. Mulachara Pradipa is frequently cited. Monks give sermons on them. But if I talk in terms of scholarship, in terms of Indological scholarship, so traditional Digambara scholarship took an interest in these law books, not to a very great extent. So we do not find a lot of material. So we find a lot of articles in Jain magazines. But if we consider scholarship in the form of monographs or written books about these monastic law books, so there are hardly anything. There are hardly 1 or 2 volumes which I came across. Rest there are critical editions to which the authors and the editors give very important introductions. But yes, not much has been done. And the real research gap lies in Western Indology. So while in traditional Jain circles, these texts have been studied, these texts have been translated, they hold certain importance, precisely because they discuss monastic conduct. But in international Indology, this entire corpus is basically neglected. It has not been studied much. And one historical reason is that Digambara Jainism in itself has been not studied with that great focus. But yes, things are changing now. But this textual corpus, not only medieval Digambara monastic law books, but early Prakrit monastic law books, they have not received the attention which is due. And this is one of the reasons that why I got attracted to this idea first, that okay, it's something which no one has done. It is very important because it's an important corpus and it literally has a lot of things to tell. So that is why I decided to give it a shot and try to work on something which I believe will be a valuable enrichment, not just to Jain studies, but to overall ideas of how communities were forming in medieval India.
Well, talking about medieval India and how communities were forming, as well as we have already talked about how these law books played a very important role in identifying a particular community by introducing markers to particular group of people. Were there more law books written after the period that you are working on? If yes, then in what languages? I'm assuming again vernacular, but I might be wrong.
So I think in Sanskrit no more. As far as I know, I can confidently say yes, that Mulachara Pradeep was the last major Sanskrit monastic law book. I mean, the last Sanskrit monastic law books in the Digambara Jainism. I am not sure about vernaculars. But again, I find it very implausible that a tradition which has been firmly rooted in Sanskrit, it would shift to vernaculars. So I would rather say that yes, there would have been vernacular explanations of earlier Prakrit texts or Sanskrit texts. That is plausible. I have not come across that literature, but as far as I know, there was no independent monastic code of conduct produced after 15th century.
That brings me to a very other interesting question that I was thinking, because when you say that at a particular point of time the production of these law books stopped,
Yes.
and after that there are no more Sanskrit law books.
Yes.
What caused that stop and why did it stop?
Well, I mean, again, an intriguing question and a very valid question, that okay, why did it begin and why did it stop? So sorry, I do not have an answer for that, to be honest, and I have not thought it from this perspective that okay, why did this stop? Because I guess even if we look in perspective of northwestern India and central India, I guess Anagar Dharmamrita and Mulachar Pradipa would have already given a very strong source of authority to following Digambara monks and Digambara communities. So also I believe that with the development of monastic lineages further down, I think because Sakalakirti was such an important monastic figure, the Balatkar Gana monastic lineages would have just adopted his monastic law book rather than writing one new. But I might be wrong, because there is a lot of literature which has not been properly catalogued. So we might find something in vernaculars or even in Sanskrit. But as to the best of my knowledge, no, we don't have anything after that.
So it's pretty difficult to answer that question, why did it stop?
Yes.
So I just missed the date. When was the last monastic law book written in Sanskrit?
15th century CE.
15th century CE. Then much more research is required, because
Yes.
there might be many reasons for this. This might not be a single one-off event, because because when I studied Bronze Age collapse myself,
Right.
I kind of got the idea of systems collapse, where it didn't collapse in a single day, but it was rather a series of mishaps that just ended the Bronze Age. We basically do not have any answer for the Bronze Age collapse as well. That might be one plausible explanation for why the law books stopped being produced. But we cannot be sure of anything as of now.
No, and it is the production of monastic law books is certainly not a one-off event, that it was caused because of one particular reason and it stopped because of one particular reason. So there were definitely multiple perspectives and multiple aspects to this question. And yes, firstly, I'm right now more focusing on that. Why did Digambara Jains feel the need to write monastic law books in the first place? And then we also need to ask that if they were benefiting so much from writing monastic law books, why did they stop?
Well, because if monastic law books are giving a lot of power to the people, to the person, the guru itself in the community, then it is very natural from a Foucauldian perspective that the guru just keeps on increasing his power. But this might again go into the realm of corruption within a person rather than the theology itself. That's another tangent for another day.
Well, I mean, I won't 100% agree with Foucauldian lens here, because although yes, every monastic law book was preserved or was written with a point of view of social legitimacy and social authority, but to assume that Digambara authors were writing monastic law books with this rather inward motive of some sort of social power.
That's what I kind of wanted to clarify in the end as well, that this might be one of an individual perspective why a person might be doing that person is corrupt rather than the entire community itself.
No, that is true, but again, I mean, if that was the case, there would have been monastic law books being produced by every single author. One reason is that the production of monastic law book required the individual to have certain literary pedigree, because you are writing a big monastic law book. You are writing it in Sanskrit. You have to have a proper knowledge of meters, grammar, and everything. You should have read the early Prakrit law books, the Mulachara, its commentary. You should have read a breadth of literature, and that is why both Ashadhara and Sakalakirti, they were men of letters. They wrote. Sakalakirti, for example, wrote 28 Sanskrit works and 7 works in Rajasthani vernacular. So more than an individual's corruption and his desire for power, I believe it is more about first individualistic capabilities, access to manuscript, access to earlier text, your own ability to interpret them, your literary training. Also, what is your position? What is your position within the monastic lineage? And thirdly, do you actually need one monastic law book? Because if we see from that perspective, even copying a manuscript in pre-modern India was a big affair. It costed a lot of money. It was a social event, gifting that manuscript, preparing that manuscript. So yeah, from a purely economical point of view, you need to have return on investment. That if someone is writing a monastic law book, is it even required after that point of time? Is it even a right thing to do? Or you can just, because interestingly we have a lot of inscriptions or textual inscriptions, colophons about Mulachara circulation, new manuscripts of Mulachara being copied. So that means that yes, monastics were always in need of looking back to earlier sources for their own conduct, but they would not have felt a need of writing new ones. That's what I can say right now.
We have come to the final leg of the podcast now, and we have just discussed about why does someone need a law book in the first place. I was just interested, when does a law book become canon? For instance, if a person A writes the law book, how does the law book itself become a canon? Is there some sort of procedure for it to become a canon, like, let us say, debating within the community, let us say debating with other people who have written law books themselves,
right.
or how does it come to place? Because that will give an answer to the earlier question,
right.
If the person is doing it out of his own will, or if he is doing for the greater good. I would like to believe that rather he was doing it for the greater good rather than doing it for himself because of a purely economical perspective. Obviously, I do agree with the economical perspective, because in medieval India it was very difficult without the printing press to copy everything. So how does a law book become a canon?
It depends on, like, if you are associating authority and authenticity with the word canon. In that sense, I guess these monastic law books are not the canon. The canon is the early Prakrit monastic law books, namely the Mulachara and the Bhagavati Aradhana. They are the canon. They are the sources of authority for Digambara authors. And because these monastic law books, the medieval monastic law books, always claim that they are based on early monastic law books, they are rooted in them, so they cannot be considered, in my opinion, they cannot be considered canons themselves. If there is a canon of Digambara monasticism, that's the early Prakrit law books.
So for instance, if somebody finds any kind of problem with the monastic law codes that come much later in the 12th century, 13th century, and also I'm presuming then they go back to the original law books to consult whether this is a valid statement or not.
Very true, because by this time, because we also have the commentaries which fairly expand on what the primary text is saying. The only problem which people might have faced in such a situation is access, because manuscripts would not have been accessible in a given place. It is very difficult to procure a manuscript because and a lot of times they were owned like any other physical material property. But that also makes a lot of sense to me, that if you can just refer back to the original monastic law book and consult its commentary to resolve your doubts, then why would you go to a new monastic law book? So yes, it is also about what roles did these monastic law books play in medieval Digambara Jain communities, why they were composed, and what kind of social authority they carried. But in simple words, no, they are not exactly canon. They are more of texts which derive their authority from an earlier canon, and my interest is to see that while they claim, or while they largely root their monastic jurisprudence, base their monastic jurisprudence on the earlier Prakrit text, how are they re-articulating and reinterpreting when they are producing that monastic jurisprudence again, basing it on the earlier Prakrit monastic law book? What kind of changes in terms of hermeneutics, in terms of interpretation, in terms of presenting and structuring material are they making? That should be the question we should ask for.
Well, that's a very interesting thing that you just said. So before ending this podcast, for our viewers, can you just state how to start researching about Jaina Studies if somebody wants to pursue their MPhil or PhD in Jaina Studies?
Very important. So the first step is to read introductory books, introductory academic books, which give you a fair idea of what Jainism is, what are the main tenets of Jainism, what is the main philosophy of Jainism, what are the main social sects and everything. So I would highly recommend two books: the Jaina Path of Purification by Padmanabh S. Jaini and your namesake, and secondly we have the Jains by Paul Dundas. Two masterful books, very important for anyone who wants to understand what Jainism is. We also have this brilliant encyclopedia of Jainism, which is very useful, which has a lot of different articles on different things. And then it depends on what kind of work are you trying to do. If you want to go with something like philosophy, you should read some people who have worked on Jain philosophy, like Bimal Krishnamati has written a book on Anekantvada, which is very good. We also have other people, like we have in Birmingham itself, we have Murray Hill and Goris, who is working on Jain logic. And this is an advice I give to anyone who wants to go through Indian religions, that you first start with introduction. You get a basic overview of what the history is of that particular tradition, what are its core beliefs. Then you try to engage with other secondary scholarship, and then only after developing some sort of confidence, but you should definitely do that, you should engage with primary text. And only then, even if it is translation, it is preferable to read it in its original language. But even if it's translation, until and unless you are not interpreting a shastra yourself with the help of previous commentators and with the help of tradition, I guess the real reward lies there in understanding the shastra, not just understanding its overview.
Well, thanks a lot for this conversation. I loved talking to you.
It was so great talking on your podcast. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.